Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. Yesterday, Ukraine made military history by a simultaneous drone attack against 4 Russian air bases. Peter Dickinson, the editor of the Atlantic Council for Ukraine Business, is with us tonight to update us on both what happened with this audacious attack and exactly what happened and how it happened, but also what's going on with the Russian invasion war in Ukraine. Peter Dickinson, welcome back to the show.
Hi, Brian. Thanks for having me. Pleasure to join you.
My pleasure. So what do you know about what happened? Like, this is, I just seen it cross all of the news just yesterday. What actually happened? Do you know?
Well, it seems to have been the culmination of a very long and intricate plan that Ukraine has hatched over, according to Ukrainian sources, over like 18 months. So for a year and a half, Ukraine has been planning this attack. So that puts it back into late 2023. So this has been a long time sort of in gestation, in preparation. It's a very complex process. And what they appear to have done is they appear to have smuggled a significant number of drones into Russia. They've had an operational base inside Russia, or maybe a number of operational bases. They've then planted these drones in sort of concealed areas in the top of what looks to have been kind of like cargo containers, the sort of standard sort of cargo freight containers, and then had them loaded onto lorries. And so the lorries have then taken these containers carrying the drones, and it seems from what I've read, it seems like the people involved in taking these lorries didn't know what their cargoes were. Taking these vehicles with the drones to the proximity of the air bases, and then at the moment on Sunday, at the given moment, then the Ukrainians activated these drones and launched the attack. And so they were the air defenses at these air bases are set up to confront a threat from long distance, so that you'd see the drones approaching perhaps from tens of kilometers away, and the goal would be to try and hit them well before they got close to the air bases. So I think what the Ukrainians have been able to do is to sort of get underneath those defenses, to get closer, as it were, because they've managed to get on the ground so close with these sort of secret launch pads, as it were, and get them into under the perimeter of the air defenses. And it would seem they've had enormous success in striking Russia's bombing fleet. So these are the bombers that Russia uses to bomb Ukraine. Whenever we have major air raids in Ukraine, the Russians use drones, but they also use cruise missiles and ballistic missiles, and those missiles are fired overwhelmingly by the bombers that are based at these air bases in Russia, at various locations in Russia. So Ukraine has basically gone after these, rather than shooting down the missiles, which is what they've been doing for the last 3 years. This time, what they've tried to do, and what this whole operation's been about, is saying, okay, instead of taking out the missiles, let's take out the planes themselves. Let's take out, the phrase you hear often used is, let's take out the archer rather than the arrow. The means of delivery. So the Ukrainians have been, are very encouraged by this. They've said that it was a big success. They're claiming that they've knocked out around 1/3 of Russia's entire bombing fleet. Now, that figure is going to be disputed.
1/3 of Russia's entire bombing fleet?
Yeah, that's what they're claiming. Now, of course, that could be an exaggeration. The video footage indicates, the video footage that we've seen so far suggests that it's that there were a lot of planes hit. You see, there is footage of significant damage at a number of different airfields. So, 1/3 may be overstating it, but it's certainly significant. And that has a big impact because these planes are Soviet-era planes. They're not in production anymore. Russia doesn't currently have the capabilities to manufacture these planes. So if they're lost, they're essentially irreplaceable. Now, of course, Russia could re-establish those production lines, you would assume, and perhaps get some, maybe some of them are repairable. But certainly for the short to medium term, it's got to have an impact on the Russians. And also beyond the material impact, it's going to send shockwaves through the Russians that the Ukrainians are so able to get within, to get inside their defenses and to attack them so deep. Because some of these attacks took place, thousands of kilometers from Ukraine, far, far away, where these people thought, the Russians thought they were safe. So, it's a big deal in terms of the specific military impact, and it's a big deal in terms of the psychology of the war, and how the Russians view this conflict and how the Russians view their own vulnerabilities.
The 18-month planning time frame, the simultaneous attacks on 4 different air bases, and this idea that they were transported by lorries that weren't aware of what they were transporting toward the bases, and then the drones somehow exited wherever they were stored, all at the same time, and it's incredible to think about.
It's an incredibly complex operation, and people are saying it's it's one for the books. It's a real, it's historic. It will be studied. People are comparing it to some of the most famous operations. The obvious one that people are comparing it to the more recently the Israeli pages that they used against Hezbollah. But some are even talking about the Trojan horse and the Greeks at Troy, the way they managed to sneak in these drones. So it's a big deal, and for the Ukrainians, it's a huge morale boost. And again, it shows how capable they are. What they're available. The idea that they were able to plan this for such a long time and maintain secrecy, the secrecy.
So why announce it? Because if you announce it once, one presumes you can't do it again.
I mean, they've gone very public with it as soon as they've done it. So I would assume they understood that once they've done it, the Russians are going to be able to unravel it, and they're going to be, I assume they did, they assessed this and said, look, we our best, it makes sense for us to capitalize on the information value of this, because the Russians are going to know how it happens. They're going to have to work it out. It's not, it's not that big a mystery of how it happened. There's video footage of the drones emerging from these freight containers, so the Russians saw it happen in real time, and they videoed it and they filmed it, so it wouldn't have taken them long to sort of piece together, I think, what had gone on. So I think the Ukrainians have made the decision, there's no point keeping quiet after the fact. We get a lot more value out of it if we actually talk about how we did it and tell people, look, we did this, because it's very, very embarrassing for the Russians. And it makes people, look at the Ukrainians in a little slightly different way and say, okay, these guys are, we know they've got courage. We know they're good fighters. They're also smart, and they're also cunning. They can also pull off something of this audacious.
Well, these jets are expensive, so this has got to be a massive economic hit to the Russian military establishment, let alone the military impact.
Yeah, well, I mean, the figures that are being bandied about today are in the billions. Yeah, because we're talking about, of course, it depends on how many of these planes have gone. But again, I would say, technically it's in the billions, but they don't make these planes anymore. They don't have the production lines to make them. So, really, they're priceless. They've relied on these Soviet era bombers for decades, and they have quite a significant fleet. But now that fleet got a lot smaller today, and so it's really not clear how they're going to be able to replace them. So the numbers, we can talk about billions, but you could argue, I think, entirely validly to say that it's priceless. You can't put a price on this because it's going to be that difficult for the Russians to replace them.
What's the media response in Kyiv in Ukraine been? What's the public response been like?
Oh, people have been extremely enthusiastic about it. There's been a huge wave of excitement and satisfaction. This is not just an audacious military operation. These bombers kill Ukrainians every day. When you hear of an apartment building being hit, or a playground, or a hospital, or whatever the target may be, just bombs going off, missiles hitting in urban areas and killing people in the streets. Those bombs are being fired by these bombers. So this is seen as a very sort of justice, essentially. This is enormously satisfying for Ukrainians to see these bombers go up in flames and to see Ukraine strike back against them. So there's a lot of satisfaction that Ukraine's been able to pull off the operation, and especially because of the targets here are so. This is such a source fury for the Ukrainian people and bitterness and trauma. Because we're living in Ukraine, or not every night, but certainly on a weekly basis, sometimes every other night. We have missile attacks from these bombers, which hit, hammer into our cities, keep people awake all night at a minimum, and very often lead to death and destruction. So certainly, it's something that the Ukrainian people have today have really enjoyed.
I can well imagine. Peter, we're going to take a break for 2 minutes for some messages and come back with you in just 2 minutes. Everyone stay with us. Peter Dickinson is going to talk a little bit about some of these issues that have been talked about as war crimes recently. We're going to talk about NATO. We're going to talk about Putin. This will be a good roundup of what's going on in Ukraine with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the war that's going on right now, and also Trump, Putin, negotiations, if that's what we call them, etc. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're chatting tonight with Peter Dickinson. He is the editor for the Atlantic Council of in Ukraine for what's going on, and writes and posts very frequently about Ukraine. He's from where are you from? You're from the UK, correct?
Yes, I'm from Britain. Yeah, from England. Yeah, from England.
And you've lived in Kyiv for a couple decades?
Yeah, more than 25 years now, just over 25 years.
And you've done a great job of reporting on what's going on in Ukraine, and so I appreciate that. You wrote in the Atlantic Council about UN investigators have concluded that a coordinated Russian campaign of deadly drone strikes targeted in southern Ukraine's region is a crime against humanity. Tell us about this.
Yeah. This is a new report that's just come out this week, last week, in fact, from the UN investigative body. It's actually an independent unit, but it's set up by the United Nations into alleged war crimes and atrocities in Ukraine. Human rights issues, human rights abuses. Now, this relates to very specifically in southern Ukraine, the only major regional capital that Russia was able to capture during this war was a city called Kherson, which is a city on the Dnipro River in the south of Ukraine. And it's across the river in the western half of Ukraine. So if you imagine that the invasions come from the east, the Russians have swept in from the east there, and they got to the river, and they managed to cross the river only at one point, which was Kherson. And so they captured this city, which was a regional capital. Now, in 2022, the Ukrainians liberated that city and pushed them back across the river. So that was a very big deal, because it was a big city to capture for the Ukrainians to liberate, but also because it pushed the Russians back into the eastern half of Ukraine and made it much more difficult for Russia to try and expand its invasion in terms of conquering the whole of Ukraine. So it's a very important region. And Putin had claimed Kherson while the Russians were there. He made a very big deal of saying he'd annexed it, and it was now part of Russia. And he held a big ceremony in Moscow and said that it was now Russian forever. So he really put his personal mark on this. And then weeks later, Ukraine liberated it, and all the people came into the streets and celebrated Ukraine's liberation. So it's very humiliating for Putin. And since then, the Russians, so now they're on the other side of the river, they're basically pummeling this city with artillery. And for the last year, they've also been conducting a very indiscriminate but very coordinated, in a military sense, campaign of terror, basically, of drone attacks on the civilian population. So anyone who lives in the city of Kherson, and it's a sizable city, it's around a pre-war population of about 350,000, I believe, 400,000. Basically, anyone living in that city now, anyone out and about doing their daily business is at risk of just being hit by a drone. So the drones are flying in the air. They're close enough to be in the zone from the Russians on the other side of the river, on the other side of the riverbank, and they're basically just terrorizing them. And they've killed around 150 people so far in this campaign. The Ukrainians have called it a human safari, because they feel hunted. They're basically being hunted like animals, anywhere they go. And this has been in the Ukrainian news for a long time, but the international media has been quite slow to pick it up. So hopefully now that the United Nations has conducted an investigation and has concluded that this is a crime against humanity, that this is a coordinated policy. This is clearly centrally coordinated by the Russian military, i.e. by the Kremlin.
So these are drones being controlled from across the river that are targeting not military people. You're sure of this? Individuals.
Yes, 100%.
And you say also ambulances? And
Yes.
ambulances on the way to go collect and treat victims?
Yeah, they will work as a team. So one drone operator will hit the victim, will hit someone out and about on the streets, someone driving their car down the road or walking their dog or whatever it may be, injure them or perhaps kill them, and then they will wait for the ambulance to come. And as the ambulance approaches, they will hit the ambulance as well, and presumably try to at least disable the ambulance, perhaps kill the people there as well. So this is a very coordinated campaign. I mean, if you read the UN report, which is linked in the article that you mentioned, it speaks specifically about the coordinated nature, the fact that this is not random attacks this is not collateral damage or random attacks. This is a calculated policy. We're talking about over 100 people being killed in individual incidents and many more being wounded. So there's been this is a daily occurrence where these guys are flying, and the Russians make no secret of this. The Russians are not doing this surreptitiously. They're posting videos of these kills online to music, like video games, celebrating them, glorifying them, and posting them with messages, basically saying, get out of the city or we're going to kill you too, sort of thing. And they post them on their social media accounts, the Russian military, the Russian soldiers, Russian war bloggers, and they have thousands of people following these accounts. So this is a good example, I think, of where amongst the Russians themselves and the Ukrainians, this is no secret, but internationally, it's not so well known yet. So I'm really hopeful that the UN report now will shed some light on this and will bring home to people the scale of what the Russians are doing here.
I found your article, frankly, very shocking. I want to read a paragraph from it, if I could. In addition to daily drone strikes, Russia has sought to maximize the psychological pressure on residents of the Kherson region via social media channels. UN investigators reported that video footage of drone attacks on Ukrainian civilians is regularly disseminated on Russian Telegram channels, some of which have thousands of subscribers. This video footage shows drone strikes along with the resulting deaths and destruction in the style of video games, often accompanied by background music. Meanwhile, menacing messages posted on Telegram call on Ukrainians to flee the region. Get out of the city before the leaves fall. You are destined to die, read one message quoted in the UN report. Seriously? This sounds unhuman.
Well, again, this is the reality of the war as it's seen by the people here in Ukraine and as it's waged by the Russians. When the Russians speak internationally, they put on a very different face. They try to put on a much more civilized face, and they talk about security threats and legitimate concerns and NATO expansion and things like this. When it comes down to Ukraine and Russia, they say, we're going to kill you. We're going to kill you all, and we don't think you have the right to live. And I'm being very polite here. I mean, they say it in a much more brutal manner. It's a very, very brutal invasion, and they make no bones about that. It's really, this is the reality. I think this particular campaign in the Kherson region is part of that. I mean, it's by far it's not exceptional in that sense, but it is a good example of the tone of the wider invasion. As the Russians themselves see it, and certainly as the Ukrainians see it, but that is often that's often missing international coverage. I say, because the Russians are very careful to try and sort of mind their language and sort of dress up their agenda, as it were, when they're talking to the international audiences, and a lot of so that doesn't always come across. But I think this is a good example of what it's really all about.
You also talked about Russian fiber optic drones. Tell me about that, if you could.
Well, this war, since the war began, so more than 3 years ago, the battlefield has really been transformed. When it began, it was all about tanks and artillery, quite traditional in that sense. Not that different from wars that we've seen over the last 4 or 5 decades, or even going back to World War II to a degree. But it's really changed very quickly and very radically since then, and the key element is drones. Drones are the X factor. Now drones are the dominant force on the battlefield, or rather over the battlefield. You can't move on the battlefield now anywhere around the front lines without getting picked up by drones. So what you've had is kind of like an arms race, a technological arms race over the last few years, trying to get an edge on each other in terms of innovations. And with the drones, the key thing with drones is to block them. So you imagine you have a drone, you have an operator. The objective, if you're trying to defend yourself, is to break the connection between the drone operator and the drone. So you have electronic jamming technology. So most vehicles now, most tanks and troop carriers and cars even, and even individual soldiers will have jamming equipment now. They'll carry that. That's like a basic piece of kit these days, because without it, you're going to get killed by a drone. So they use that to block drones. And the name of the game is jamming. Now, recently, the Russians have been able to get ahead because they've been using in very large numbers fiber optic drones. And as the name suggests, I mean, at first I didn't really understand what it was, going back a little while when we first started hearing about them. And I actually saw them in operation. I met some people who ran these things, and Ukrainians have them too. It's essentially a drone on a wire. So it's a drone which has a canister attached to it, and in the canister is around, it can be up to 10 or 15 kilometers of wire, which it's basically like fishing wire or piano wire, very, very fine wire. It's fiber optic cable, and that cable is the connection with the operator. So this drone can fly, up to 10 kilometers with this wire coming out the back. And it is basically unjammable. You can't jam it because the connection is via the wire. So the only way you could jam it would be literally to physically cut the wire, like with a giant pair of flying scissors or something, or shears or something. So it's literally, although it's kind of counterintuitive because it seems quite primitive, compared to the very complex, digital technologies that have been used and to control these drones. But this wire drones, on these fiber optic cables, are unjammable. So they've proved to be a really, really formidable piece of kit, because you can't stop them, basically. You can't, none of the jamming will work. And so it's really put the cat amongst the pigeons. And it's given the Russians a big advantage at the moment, because they have a lot more of them. So the technology is not secret. Ukraine has the same technologies, more or less, give or take. But the Russians have invested a lot in producing these in large quantities. And so they're well ahead of the game now. So they have a very large superiority in terms of volumes of this, and they're using them on the front line very effectively. So it causes problems for the Ukrainians. The weakness of these drones with the cables, of course, is some maneuverability problems. They can get caught up in trees or power pylons or whatnot, or buildings. But the key thing, as I say, they cannot be jammed, so they are a formidable weapon, and we're seeing a lot of them now on the battlefield. The Ukrainians are now scrambling to try and sort of catch up in terms of their own production, and also thinking about solutions to fight back against them.
With planes, we have planes fighting planes. Do we have drones fighting drones?
Oh yeah, already, that's happening now. I mean, it's not happening too much now, but it is happening. I mean, I've seen, the Ukrainian drone ecosystem is much more diverse, and that's a strength and a weakness. With the Russians, they've basically said, okay, we're going to focus on a couple of models, and we're going to mass produce them, and we're going to streamline them and make them as good as we can, and we're going to mass produce them. It's a very Soviet way of doing it, and it works. It's effective. So one of the things they focused on is fiber optic drones. Another one they focus on is the kamikaze drones they use to bomb Ukraine, every night. And their production there is ramping up massively. They've gone from making a few hundred a month to making thousands of them a month, and that's a real issue. So that's the Russian model, just massive numbers, massive volume. The Ukrainians is much more diverse. You've got hundreds of different companies. They're all producing all sorts of different things, and they're not really mass producing any one model. But you are seeing all sorts of curious models coming out that do exactly what you say, fighting drones against drones. So I've seen drones that are literally armed with a shotgun, so it can fly up, and the drone is shooting a shotgun at another drone in the sky, for example. There are interceptor drones, because one of the functions of drones is to bomb. They carry bombs, or they are literally bombs themselves, and they can be flown into the enemy. They're called first-person view drones. These are the drones that you see the videos of, with the guy with the sort of goggles on, and they fly the drone into the target. You also have a lot of observation drones. So the drone will go up and fly over the battlefield, identify the enemy positions, and then pass the coordinates back, and then traditional artillery or other drones can take it out. So a lot of the some of the drone battles you see are, for example, the Ukrainians have developed a lot of drones that will take down Russian observation drones. Russian drones that are moving along the front lines and observing, so they'll be trying to take them down. So yeah, there's drone versus drone is already a very real thing, and we're going to see a lot more of that.
You also posted about the new German chancellor announcing a plan to help Ukraine produce long range missiles that you said could change things in regards to attacking Putin's war machine inside Russia. Tell me about that movement, if you could.
Well, I mean, one of the big issues that Ukraine's partners have had since the war began is, they're very cautious about getting too dragged into the war directly. They don't want to become participants. They understand that it's very much in their interest to prevent a Russian victory in Ukraine. They're very committed to Ukraine, at least at a minimum, surviving and preferably winning the war, however we can define victory. But I think their overriding concern in many cases has been not to get dragged directly into the war themselves. And Putin has been very good at exploiting that, and he makes these nuclear threats specifically because of that. He plays on these Western fears, this fear of escalation. He uses nuclear threats very regularly and very directly to sort of warn Ukraine's partners that if you go too far, if you give Ukraine the right to, if you give Ukraine weapons to attack us, we will attack you, and this could become a nuclear confrontation, and so on and so forth. So Putin plays on these fears. These fears are very real, and that has resulted in a lot of restrictions on Ukraine. So we've had a lot of situations where the Western partners, the Americans, the Brits, the Germans, the French, have given Ukraine different categories of weapons, particularly missiles, but have said, okay, you can't use them in Russia. You can use them against Russian troops in Ukraine. And then more recently, over the last year, they've started to say, okay, you can use them in the border zone, where, if, for example, the Russians are firing into Ukraine from Russian territory, you can use these across the border. So they're allowing some attacks inside Russia, but they're still placing restrictions. They're still putting, some sort of limitations on it. And that's basically essentially meant that most of Russia is a safe zone, is a safe haven for Putin and for his army to launch their invasion. So Ukraine's already heavily outnumbered, heavily outgunned by the Russians, and they're also essentially, they've had one hand tied behind their back by their allies, saying, okay, we'll give you some military aid, but you can't use it, where you think it should be used.
So how does this announcement by the new German chancellor change things?
Well, it could. I mean, we don't know yet, but I mean, what essentially he's saying is, rather than giving Ukraine the weapons and saying, okay, here you go, here's the missiles, go and use them, which he doesn't want to do, and which is exactly what I'm talking about, what none of them want to do, really. He's saying, okay, we're going to produce the missiles, and he's not being specific about exactly which categories, but one would assume it's going to be effective long-range missiles. We're going to produce them together with Ukraine in Ukraine. So at that point, these become Ukrainian missiles. I mean, these are Ukrainian weapons. They're made in Ukraine by Ukraine with German support. And they'll be using presumably German technology as well. But this is a Ukrainian missile. And he also very specifically said there are going to be no restrictions on these weapons. He didn't go into detail about what the weapons would be, but he did say already immediately no restrictions. So that basically bypasses this whole fear of escalation, and it's very significant, I would say, in itself. Also, it could set a precedent for other partners to follow suit, do the same sort of thing, and we could have a situation where Ukraine is producing more and more of these weapons, because Ukrainians need to be able to strike inside Russia. That's absolutely,
and they've got to be able to manufacture their own armaments and military and industrial equipment.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that actually, in that respect, I mean, Ukraine has spare capacity. The Ukrainian military-industrial complex is huge and has a great potential, and it was basically dormant for decades after the Soviet collapse. The Soviet Union, in the Soviet times, Ukraine was the great military-industrial engine of the Soviet Union. I mean, it was the center of tank production, missile production. They built ships in Ukraine, artillery, you name it. It was a real industrial powerhouse for the Soviet Union. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, a lot of that sort of was neglected and fell into disrepair and was allowed to sort of fall dormant. And only now, in the last few years, has Ukraine got sort of scrambling to reinvigorate that whole sector. And also, they've got the high tech aspect with the drones and electronic warfare and so forth. So they've got a lot of potential. And Ukraine is actually saying to its Western partners, they're saying, look, we appreciate the aid you give us. We appreciate the weapons you provided us. That's all great. We need more. But how about you also instead of spending all the budget you're allocating in your own countries, how about you spend some of that in Ukraine, where we're ready to go, we've got it all in place, and we know what we need, and we're making good stuff. B, it's cheaper because labor is cheaper, the costs are lower in general, and C, it's this is where we need it. Why produce it in France or England and then ship it over and go through all these issues? Just let's do it here and let's get it straight into the front line. Let's fine tune it, get it perfect. So that's the
trend. And D, as you point out, then you've got no restrictions on how it's going to be used too. So that makes a ton of sense. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back with Peter Dickinson in just 2 minutes. I want to ask him about another post that he made in regards to the potentiality of full-scale war with NATO. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes with Peter Dickinson of the Atlantic Council. Welcome back, everyone. This is the Brian Crombie Radio Hour with Peter Dickinson, the editor of the Atlantic Council Ukraine Alert. Peter, you put forward a very provocative post that you said Putin can neutralize NATO without a full-scale war by launching a Crimea-style hybrid attack to expose the emptiness of NATO's collective security commitments. And that you say there's speculation that's mounting that Russia is now actively preparing for war with NATO. Really? Seriously? War with NATO?
Well, I mean, this is that's the sort of a tweet in two parts, as it were. I mean, I think at the moment there's a lot of speculation about that Russia's preparations for a war with NATO, Russia's preparations for an attack on NATO, and a lot of people are skeptical. As I assume from your tone, you also are. I think that's a valid skepticism. The idea of Russia embarking on a full-scale war with NATO is pretty wild. It's pretty far-fetched, I would say. I would agree with that. I think it is far-fetched, and I think the Russians know that if they were to instigate a full-scale conventional war with NATO, they'd lose, and they'd lose badly, and they'd lose quickly. But the Russians know that. So I would say that first of all, Russia believes that it has the momentum at the moment. It has the momentum in Ukraine, and it has the momentum in a broader sense against the West, because it sees the West doesn't want to fight. The Russians are pushing and pushing and pushing, and they're using these intimidation tactics, nuclear threats, and so forth. And they see that the West is intimidated. The West has allowed itself to be intimidated, and they see that the West talks about we're going to get tough, but they never do. And they keep backing off, and they keep saying, let's have more talks, let's have more ceasefires, let's have more.
Is that the West, or is that just the US?
I think it's the West in general. I mean, I think now it's the US leading, but I think that, broadly speaking, we hear a lot more. Yeah, the language coming out of Western capitals is more robust, is tougher, outside of Washington. But still, broadly speaking, if we look at actions, there's still, everyone's still saying, we need the war to end. We need peace. We need to have negotiations. We need to make concessions.
Just a couple of weeks ago, there were numerous European leaders actually in Kyiv, and they got Donald Trump on the telephone, I guess. But weren't they there to suggest a real change in attitude?
Well, I mean, this is a case in point. They came to Kyiv. They made a very specific. They delivered essentially. They came to Kyiv to deliver an ultimatum to Putin. They told him, either we have a ceasefire within 48 hours, or we're going to impose very tough new sanctions on you, and we're going to increase military aid to Ukraine, and it's going to be bad news for you, Mr. Putin. The clock is ticking, and the ultimatum is on the table. And Putin came back and said, I'm just going to ignore that. Let's have talks with Ukraine next week. And basically, the Western leaders let it roll. They said, okay, whatever. We're going to pretend we never said it. We're going to take no action. We're basically not going to talk about it anymore. So they made this huge amount of fuss. So if you're a Russian, you're going to think, well, these guys are just all talk. They're just a load of talk. They don't act. They don't act on their words. They made this big threat, and they went out on a limb, and they came out. Actually, at the time, I remember saying to people here, like, if they come out on a limb that much, they can't not act because it's humiliating for them. But they did exactly that. They just completely backed down.
Because of Trump giving Putin outs constantly?
Yeah, I think that's a big factor. Yeah, it's a big factor is that none of them wants to act alone without Trump. And I think there's a sense amongst European leaders that they may have to act without Trump, but they're still clinging to the idea that they can somehow get Trump to come round, if only they can convince him that Putin is just not the guy he thinks he is, and he's wasting his time, and he's being humiliated, and it's in America's interest. Because the European leaders, one, they have a much more realistic view, I think, of what Putin's all about, and they understand that it's a very big mistake for America to step away from this and to stop supporting Ukraine. To give
Trump has made comments about saying Crimea is Russian territory. What do you think the implication of that is if he does that?
Well, I mean, any step to actually, handing Russia territory in Ukraine officially and recognizing it would be catastrophic for the international security order. I mean, it would basically be saying crime pays. It would be saying, you can invade another country. The fundamental principle of international law, or international law writ large since World War II, has been you cannot change borders by force. You cannot go into another country and take their territory and then have that recognized by the international community. So there've been all sorts of invasions over the years, of course, but there's been no officially, I don't believe any invasion which has been recognized internationally and had maps redrawn based on the use of military force. So it would be unprecedented, and it would be, as I said, disastrous for international order, because all of a sudden everyone would think, okay, so China would have opportunities to expand its territory, obviously with Taiwan, maybe elsewhere, maybe in the South China Sea. Other countries around the world would start looking at potentially reclaiming this, that, or other border regions or entire countries, for example. You'd have enormous instability, and they would all do it. And of course, Russia itself would be looking to go further. But based on this new precedent that had been set by Trump, by the world leader, saying, okay, we acknowledge this land grab and we recognize it. We hand this over. So, I mean, I think this is classic Trump, really. I think he didn't really think that through, and his advisors probably just went along with it because they're always being bullied and pushed along by Trump himself, and they know that he doesn't take kindly to being told that his ideas are ridiculous or dangerous. This is a man who talks about annexing Greenland and invading Canada, for God's sake. So this is not someone who is particularly intimidated by convention. On the contrary, he loves to go against the flow as he sees it. To be some sort of a global maverick, or however he may perceive himself to be. But it would be disastrous. There's no question. I mean, if he were to put America's stamp of approval on Russia's invasion of Ukraine and annexation of Crimea, it would be, the repercussions would be pretty profound for international security, and we will be felt everywhere.
Last week, you posted that the solution to the world's Putin problem is not a mystery. Simply sanction Russia to the max and arm Ukraine to the teeth. Problem solved. All that's required is political will and good old-fashioned courage. Ukraine will do the rest. Why aren't we doing that?
Well, it comes back to what I was talking about fear of escalation. The Western powers are afraid of being dragged into a war. They are afraid that if Russia were pushed into a corner by overwhelming force, that Putin would do something desperate. He would use nuclear weapons. That's the usual format for something desperate in terms of Putin means the use of nuclear weapons. So the idea is that he would go down that, he would take that option, and obviously that would have, very, very dangerous connotations for the whole world, and who knows where it would lead. So, and that's one key factor that's prevented the international community or the Western community from really giving Ukraine what it needs. So what they've had, I think, over the last 3 years. Really, the West has given Ukraine a lot. I mean, I wouldn't want to underestimate it. They've given them a huge amount, hundreds of billions of dollars worth of military aid, much more than I think, it's hard to think of any other country that's received this sort of level of aid. So I wouldn't want to belittle it and say it's nothing. It's not nothing, but they've given Ukraine enough to survive. They've not given Ukraine enough to win. And what they have given, they've given them with conditions, with restrictions. So, they needed to give Ukraine, just broadly speaking, maybe treble what they've given them without any conditions. And if they'd done that, especially in 2022, I think this war would have been over a long time ago. Ukraine would have won the war militarily, would have pushed Russia back, and Russia would have been very much, very much preoccupied with internal issues that would have arisen from that defeat. And it would have been settled. But instead, we had this very cautious approach, this softly approach, which has allowed Russia to consolidate, which has allowed Putin to consolidate his position domestically, to build up his forces more, to learn from early mistakes, to improve their battle strategies, their military strategies, and push forward. And now Russia is on the front foot. They're advancing, they're gaining territory, they're winning on the battlefield. They're not making huge gains, but they do have the momentum. They do have the initiative at the moment. So the West really sort of dropped the ball in 2022 and has yet to regain that initiative. And until they do, I don't think Putin's going to want to stop the war, because he's looking at it thinking, well, it's not going great, but I'm basically winning, and the longer it goes on, the more likely it is that I'm going to win. So I'm going to stick at it, because he's well past the point of no return, realistically, as he sees it, certainly in terms of his political legacy. So unless the equation has changed significantly militarily, I don't think he's going to do it. And they, the West is afraid to go down that road, but all they're doing by this cautious approach is making the problem bigger.
And
when they do have to deal with it eventually, which they will have to, it's going to, my great fear is it'll be too late for Ukraine, and also the cost for the West will be, 10 times, 20 times higher.
Dan Rice, someone you reposted, wrote that actually President Trump is actually doing good things. He may not be putting in the sanctions that you want, but trying to persuade Saudi Arabia to increase OPEC oil production and drive oil prices down is going to potentially destroy the Russian economy. Do you think that that's a potential avenue of approach?
Yes. I mean, I think Dan Rice is correct there. That's certainly a very interesting angle, and that's the sort of triangulation, as it were, where there's an interest there for Trump as well, perhaps, and for his his economic interests and America economically, and that was many people believe that was what brought the Soviet Union down ultimately. Low oil and gas prices. It caused an economic crash. The Soviets were no longer able to afford their imperial project, as it were, and as it sort of started to come apart at the seams, they sort of scrambled to try and reform things, and then it just completely fell apart. So that is a very interesting angle. Now, the trouble with economic tools are that they're slow. They don't work overnight. So it may be a long time. So, of course, it's very, very good news to see the price of oil coming down, and hopefully it will come down even further. And if it gets to a certain point, it really could become a crisis issue for the Russians, because the Russian economy is is heavily dependent on the export of oil and gas. So, if the oil price comes down further and further, it's going to be a massive hit for them, and they're not going to be able to cope with it. There's already signs of strain there. But I don't think it's going to be, economic issues are not going to bring about a quick result to this one. I think you need to do them in parallel. We need to have a military angle and the economic angle, be it sanctions or low oil price, wherever it be. But yeah, I mean, Trump is doing stuff. He's playing an interesting, in some respects, playing an interesting game, but fundamentally, he just seems to be very much aligned with this idea that, for whatever reason, he wants to be on good terms with Putin. He doesn't want to be in a confrontation with Putin. He wants to be on good terms with him, and he's prepared to sacrifice or compromise the interests of the West in general, and especially the interests of Ukraine and to a lesser extent, but also Europe, to achieve that, and that's the real issue, and that people here in Ukraine certainly are just, are horrified by that and really don't understand where he's coming from, that the leader of America is sort of positioning the idea that he needs to be on good terms with Putin. It's like, well, why would you wish for that?
It's shocking, absolutely shocking. We're going to take a final break and come back with some concluding comments with Peter Dickinson, talking about what's going on in Kyiv right now. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're chatting tonight with Peter Dickinson of the Atlantic Council Ukraine Alert about what's going on in Ukraine. But I wanted to end and give Peter you a chance. You wrote just a week ago, "Happy birthday, Kyiv. The Ukrainian capital is 1,543 years old today. It's an absolute fairy tale of a city, elegantly perched on luscious hills overlooking a majestic river dotted with idyllic sandy islands. From the Mongols to the Tsars, Nazis, Soviets, and on to today's Russian invasion, Kyiv is one of the most fought over cities in the entire world, but it remains quintessentially Ukrainian. As the song says, how can I not love you, Kyiv of mine? Peter, what's it like living in Kyiv today?
Well, wartime Kiev is a city of great contrasts. We have regular bombing raids here, which can be very, very traumatic. Sometimes they're very deadly. They can be, it's rare when there's dozens of people killed, but it can be quite often where you'll have particularly tragic incidents of families being killed in their homes. Entire families wiped out, the residential districts hit, school playgrounds and things like this. I mean, hospitals, we had a children's hospital bombed not so long ago. So those events are hugely stressful and traumatic. And beyond that, beyond the actual death toll and the destruction, just the fact of having these bombings take place, it's almost always at night. You obviously can't see anything, but you can hear a lot of huge banging going on, and that's the rockets themselves, but it's also the air defense is hitting away. So you'll have, when the drones are coming in particular, you'll hear people sort of popping away with big machine guns and different anti-aircraft weaponry. So it sounds like you're in the middle of a battlefield almost. It's extremely alarming. And occasionally there's very large explosions where buildings will shake, window panes will rattle and so on. So that's obviously very, very unpleasant and stressful. But that's that's only part of life. There's another part of life which is very, very ordinary, surprisingly ordinary. I think there's a very strong sense of resilience, people just getting on with life. People don't want to allow Russia, don't want to give Russia the win, as it were. They're determined to get on with their lives. The city itself is absolutely beautiful. Kyiv is a beautiful city. It's a lovely place. It's a very big city. It's around 4 million, so it's one of the biggest cities in Europe. But it has almost a village feel to it. It's very, very nicely laid out. It's a beautiful strolling city where you can spend hours just wandering about. The pace of life is quite sedate for such a large city, so it feels warm and attractive and welcoming. People who come to Kyiv always pick up on that. They always like the vibe of the place. They always find it very, very enjoyable, and people get very attached to it. And that's very much still here. That's very much still part of Kyiv today, even though with the wartime conditions. So it's a lot of contrast. I mean, we're a long way from the front lines here, so I wouldn't want to paint too dramatic a picture in terms of what's going. Like if you are in a city that's much closer to the front lines, that your experience would be very different. I mean, you'd be much more in the war, and I think that would be, you wouldn't be talking then about having a, sort of stiff upper lip or getting out there and still having a normal daily life. But if you were in Kyiv during the day or during the evening, you would think it was a nice European city. There's people out and about. The restaurants are full. The cafes are full. There's new places opening up all the time. New restaurants and cafes and art galleries and shops and whatnot. It's a dynamic, big, bustling European city with a very with a strong sense of its own identity and a strong sense of Ukrainian identity. So it's a
war with Russia. Unbelievable.
Yeah, and then we have a war with Russia, and every so often the air raid alarms will go off, and you remember that, oh my God, and you see around town, you see a lot of soldiers around town. There's always something going on that reminds you of the war, some sort of action or exhibition or whatnot. I spend a lot of my time attending events and conferences. There's funerals taking place to sort of soldiers all the time. So, the war is around us all the time. But life goes on. I said, if you were in Kyiv, you would probably be struck by how normal and how vibrant the city seems.
Peter Dickinson, thank you so much for joining us and updating us on numerous different things going on in the Russian invasion war with Ukraine, Ukraine. I think that this bombing raid by drones, this drone raid on Russian air forces and air bombers is great news. So thank you very much for telling us about that.
Thanks for having me. My pleasure to speak with you again.
That's our show for tonight. Everybody, thank you for joining us. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online, even from Kyiv, at www.saga960am.ca. Good night, everybody.